Good evening or afternoon or morning. Today is January 18th, 2023, and I'm Dan Hammermesh. I'm the host of this video panel on environment and labor markets. It's a pleasure to have with me today two experts who have written widely on this subject. The first is Nico Pestel, who is Associate Professor of Economics and Education/Labor Market at Maastricht University in the Netherlands. The other is Wayne Gray, who is Professor of Economics at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts, and an NBER Research Associate. And they're both, of course, longtime research fellows at IZA. I have to stress that. Anyway, gentlemen, thanks for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thanks. I want to get started with a question for Nico. I'll have a couple of questions, one each for each of our participants. So let me read the question to you. There's been a push for green energy production. Is that going to cause a total loss of jobs? Or if it is, will it cause a decline in wages for those who remain employed? What do you think about that?
So then it's very interesting that both the proponents as well as the opponents of green energy policies make a kind of a jobs argument. So either people argue that investing more in green energy production will create new and additional jobs in these green energy sectors. On the other hand, people who are more opposed to it also make a jobs argument by saying, well, this will then destroy jobs in existing jobs in non-green sectors, or at least crowd out jobs that would have been created by investing in other sectors. So a lot of people have looked at this, and the empirical evidence shows that kind of both sides do have a point here, but overall the effects kind of balance each other. So the net employment effect of investing in green energy production is most of the time positive, but it's also very small. However, when it comes to green energy production, so for example, investments in renewable energy sources like wind and solar, or the energy transition more generally, so the scarcity of workers who have the relevant skills is becoming increasingly a bottleneck for the implementation of these investments. So you can imagine that for all kinds of energy-related investments, you need a lot of people who have technical skills. And this is a group of workers that is very scarce in some countries, especially here in Europe. So it could be that, governments will have to focus on investing, first of all, in having the skills in the workforce to be actually able to implement green energy production.
Okay, let me then follow up with you on that. If what you say is correct, that is more jobs in this high-skilled area, green energy, fewer jobs in the low-skilled area, wouldn't that transition exacerbate wage inequality in these countries?
Well, to the extent that it's only going in the direction of that green energy jobs are what you call high-skill jobs and non-green jobs are low-skill jobs, then this would be true. And there is certainly something about this. But, we also need simply construction workers who can build, new grid lines for electricity grid. So that's not necessarily only high-skilled jobs. Of course, we also need high-skilled engineers, but we also need the construction workers to set up the grids, or the workers who just put solar panels on rooftops. So that's not necessarily only going to the very high-skill jobs, but it's technical occupations that are scarce at the moment, and which increasingly are, hampering actually getting investments implemented.
Okay, let me switch now and ask Wayne a question. We've talked about the what with Nico. Let me talk with Wayne about where. And this is not so much a matter of energy production, about how climate change might affect where production takes place and what production will take place where. Any thoughts on that?
Yes, I think sort of 2 points on that. One is that there's climate change itself, I mean, the expectation is that it will get a lot hotter. And that's likely to have a disproportionate impact on poor tropical countries, both because they are already pretty hot, and so the hotter temperatures are going to make outdoor work, particularly construction work and agricultural work, sorts of things, much more dangerous. I saw an article a couple of weeks ago about pressure on the health sector in Nepal because they sent lots of workers to do construction projects in the Persian Gulf area and such, and a lot of them were getting kidney damage, and so there was dialysis and kidney transplants needed because the work was so strenuous and so dangerous to be, outdoors working in, very high temperatures. And that's going to get worse. I think that's, in terms of where some of the more serious health effects or productivity impacts could be. There's also the impact in terms of, say, the agricultural sector, where Canada and Siberia might do better. They may not do better, but they may do relatively better in having longer growing seasons and warmer temperatures. But again, sort of tropical countries are going to be facing even more tropical temperatures, potentially less rainfall, and so that's likely to be difficult for those labor markets there as well. I think there is also the question of, not the direct impact of climate change, but the regulatory response to that. That is that some countries are going to make it, do the energy transition more than others, and that may raise their costs of production. And so there might also be some of what we might think of as the more typical environmental economics concerns about production shifting away from high cost areas.
Let me ask you this then. We talked about tropics versus non-tropics. Let's take two, I call them countries, the United States, which is a country, and Europe, which taken together I view being very much a pro-European. I view Europe as a country going all the way from Finland down to Italy or Greece. How do you see in those two, quote, countries, unquote, the same things developing? Anything special about that?
Well, I think that the U.S. has been sadly laggard in terms of a willingness to approach the energy transition. And certainly there's a lot of resistance to the idea of, a tax on carbon or anything that would tend to make coal production less attractive, even though that's been going down for various reasons anyway. I think that that's likely to mean that Europe is already doing much more than the U.S. in terms of reducing carbon emissions, and they will probably continue to be ahead of the U.S. as far as that goes. I think that there is a positive side thing as well in terms of reducing carbon emissions tends to reduce other kinds of pollution as well. So there's a lot of evidence that having a lot of particulates in the air kills off people and makes them less productive. And so I think that to the extent that we can shift away from burning coal and to a lesser extent natural gas, we're going to be helping the labor market be more productive in that respect.
It's nice to hear from both of you in these answers a lot of positive thoughts. And usually on the environment, all I hear is negative stuff. So this is very gratifying to me. So look, the U.S. does a little bit of regulation. We have the Paris Accords, blah, blah, blah. Should individual governments push for more? Is the issue regulation? Is it administrative enforcement? How do you handle these things? Wayne, your thoughts on this?
My thoughts on that are that the pollution, this carbon emissions, in principle, would be a lot easier to deal with than something like toxic pollutants, because one could, put a tax on fuels proportional to their degree of carbon emissions and collect that in a fairly we have a lot of mechanisms that collect that pretty easily, as opposed to somebody dumping some drums of toxic pollutants in a river somewhere. I think that the pollution tends to be sort of large or relatively controllable. So I don't think that some of the administrative side issues will be as difficult to handle as they could be for other kinds of pollution. But then again, at least in the US, politicians seem to be reluctant to put as obvious a thing as a tax on pollution. And so I think that resistance could shift the way that governments respond into areas that I think that would be less effective, trying to figure out facility by facility how much they should be emitting or something like that.
Quite something. Economists, however, have only been talking about pollution taxes for 50 years in a serious way, so we can't expect things to take place overnight.
Well, we did get the EU permit trade.
Right. No, the EU has done much more than the US, certainly. Nico, your thoughts on the same question?
Yeah, so I totally agree with Wayne, and I just want to re-emphasize so what Wayne described, what I would label as the co-benefits of regulation of carbon emission reductions. So when it comes to climate change, the main problem is the greenhouse gases that are in and of itself not toxic or something like that. They're just a quote unquote a problem for the climate. But if you manage as a government to reduce emissions overall, you will, as a co-benefit, essentially also reduce the emissions of pollutants like particulate matter. There's now a huge literature that shows that these pollutants are damaging not only to the health of people, and not only to those people who are in a bad health condition anyways, but also to younger people, to children, to workers overall, reducing their productivity, reducing or hampering the learning of students. Governments can create a large benefits by further regulating pollution overall or emissions overall. And the recent research has shown that that pollution, especially air pollution, does have negative effects even at levels that are currently considered to be okay according to the current policy standards. Of course, you always have to also balance against the costs of this regulation. But I think especially the air pollution literature shows that there are certainly still benefits to heap, even in the US over the past decades or so, there have been very huge improvements in air quality overall, but there's still a way to go. And I think if you can convince also people and voters that environmental regulation can actually help people, and especially also poor people, that might be easier to convince them of this regulation instead of arguing with global climate change. But again, it might come as a co-benefit, so it's worthwhile to think about further environmental regulations overall.
Let me ask you both, which I hadn't asked before when I sent you some questions. So let's say we actually do all this. Let's look at it by income category in the US and in the EU. How's it going to affect income inequality, which is, after all, the main economic issue of our time? Nico and then Wayne.
So you mean regulation overall?
Yeah, regulation, reducing the rate of climate change, or actually reversing climate change to the extent that's possible.
Yeah. So I think it has the potential to reduce income inequality. So I think improving environmental conditions overall, mitigating climate change will disproportionately benefit poor people, because they typically also have worse health conditions, are more vulnerable also to heat. Those are the people who are typically also more exposed to heat, to working outdoors or to working under uncomfortable conditions. Maybe also living in not so well isolated homes. So kind of heat waves will affect them more when they happen, and they will happen more often in the future, and they will become more intense, which means that this has health effects. This has also maybe effects of how productive can you be at your job? Can you go to your job in the first place? Can you go to work? So all these things, I think, taken together will benefit lower income people more than the richer.
Wayne, any modification, amendment, or you can agree
Well,
if you want.
I think I generally agree. Those of us who are fortunate enough to have air conditioning, just turn it up a little higher if it gets hotter outside, and those without can't. And I think that the health consequences, now they may not show up very well in income inequality statistics, but I think if you were measuring utility or well-being, there would definitely be a reduction in inequality.
Okay, great. Let me give a background to the next question. So I'm pretty old. I've watched over the years in New York City, which I used to visit all the time. When I came here as a kid in the early 50s, I'd find myself washing my hands and face 3 or 4 times a day because the pollution was terrible. Now it's really clean by the standards I'm used to. And I'm pretty sure that's true in rich worldwide areas. Where do you think we'll be on this? This is prediction, which economists are famous for doing and not very good at. Where do you think we'll be on this 30 years from now? On environment, on energy, on climate. Wayne, you want to go first?
Sure. I'm not very optimistic that we will be managing to keep emissions as low as they're talking about trying to get to like 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees Celsius warming. I think the U.S. is, I don't have a very high opinion of our ability to get a good coalition going together, but given the divisiveness of the parties and the strong disagreements on the issues, I think that it will get warmer. It will probably be, stormier and unpleasant in various ways. I think that the things that could make that better, short of miraculously waving a magic wand in Washington and making everybody friends, would be technology. It could be that some of the, as the renewable energy gets cheaper, that shifts things in that direction without requiring a lot of government help. And I'm sort of wondering whether some of this stuff may push us towards some geoengineering, which is scary in a way. That is, a long time back, I remember hearing about, it wouldn't be that expensive to have, a little thing, a little blimp or whatever on the North Pole, putting some particulates in the air and sort of simulating a volcanic explosion, which we know is very good at reducing temperatures in the world. And so there are, people that are talking about that as a possible alternative to the difficulty of getting people to switch away from gas guzzlers. So it'll be interesting to see how things go. I'm sure we will be using much more electricity and less of fossil fuels, but I don't know that we'll have gotten all the way there.
Okay. I would call that not too pessimistic. I think it's a fair summary. Nico, what are your thoughts on this one?
Well, I share Wayne's skepticism. Here in Europe, well, at least we do have the ambition. So the European Union aims to be climate neutral by 2050. So that means the economy would be working on a net zero greenhouse gas emissions. So which I think the net zero already implies potentially also part of the geoengineering aspects that Wayne mentioned. So it means that you can have positive emissions of greenhouse gases, but that on the other hand, you also manage with some technology to get carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, so that you're on a net zero path. So I wish that we, not only in Europe but globally, achieve this goal. But governments in the US, in Europe, and in other parts of the world really need to speed up and increase their efforts to do so. And currently we have in Germany, where I live, another debate on this, also induced by the war in Ukraine and the energy crisis related to that. Is can we use coal for a bit longer? Can we use nuclear energy, which is very controversial in Germany, not so much in other countries? I have the impression to close the gap that is currently opening in terms of electricity coming from gas power plants, which was supposed to be the so-called bridge technology until we are fully on renewable energies. Now we don't import gas anymore from Russia. So all these debates show that energy production is still controversial, and it's not clear that we are going quickly and decisively enough into a direction where we can rely on renewable only.
Okay, let me ask a final question now. Quick answers. This is a worldwide problem. Is there any way to foster international cooperation on this? Nico, you want to go first?
Yes. So obviously, global problems should be addressed ideally with global efforts and global cooperation. What could it be? So I think Wayne already touched upon the carbon pricing or the taxing of carbon that you potentially could organize globally. Currently, we do have some regions, some individual countries in the world that have implemented such carbon pricing schemes. But a global carbon price would be helpful. That is also, ambitious enough to really also provide incentives for firms to reduce carbon emissions. But agreeing on such a global market for carbon emissions is, of course, something that requires global coordination. And there, I'm also skeptical, given political tensions that are actually increasing or have been increasing over the past couple of years, between the US and China, for example, which are two big emitters of greenhouse gases. So I think we have to be skeptical there, but there are solutions possible, and I think economists have their ideas on how to implement them, but it also needs the political will to do so.
Wayne?
Yeah, I think that the couple of ways that I think rich countries could wind up helping poor countries, because that's, we are where the money is at, right? So we ought to be paying more of the cost. I think one possibility is that if we have active permit trading even within the rich countries, and there were mechanisms for effectively letting rich polluters buy some carbon reductions in poor countries, that might be a way of moving some money from the rich to the poor. I think the rich countries could also be subsidizing technology a lot, and that might make it cheap enough for poor countries to be able to reduce their emissions. And finally, there is the question of whether rich countries decide to put on border carbon tax adjustments so that goods coming in have tariffs or whatever proportional to their carbon emissions, which would then provide incentives for poorer countries to get greener as well. I think having the political will in the rich countries to be willing to do this, we sort of hear about how nice it is that the young people are all excited about this more and more willing to do stuff. But one of the things they don't seem to be doing is voting, and that may have an issue in terms of actually translating that desire for, a greener and cleaner world into actual government actions. So be interesting to see where it goes.
Great. I think the overall tone of this discussion has been mildly pessimistic, but not as pessimistic as it could have been. Gentlemen, Nico Pestel, Wayne Gray, thank you so much for joining me today. This is very helpful, and I learned something, which is always wonderful. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, Dan. It was a good discussion.
Yeah. Thank you, Dan. It was a great pleasure.